Vincent, Chente, Montalvo, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to JT the LA Storyteller podcast, also known as Los Cuentos de Los Ángeles. We were just saying only a moment ago that this story, the one we look to tell or shed some light on through our conversation, is an American story. It's an LA story. It's a story of cycles that our communities have had to get through and continue getting through. And yet, for those listeners out there who are truly intent on getting to know the city and the people of this city and what they are still fighting for, this is exactly that kind of cuento. So I really have to thank you once again for joining me this evening in the midst of all these different meetings that you've got. Vincent, Chente, Montalvo, thank you so much for being here. And ¿cómo estamos? How are you doing?
Good, JT. Like you say, the work doesn't end, and we're still here decades later, generations later, still fighting for, what's right for us, the injustices. And I thank you for your work, your channel, and your contribution to the fight, because without media like yours, it really isn't centered within the community's voice, and yours really does center it. So I appreciate all that you contribute and give out and having us on here. So thank you.
110%. And I really enjoy speaking with you so very much because it is about bringing these communities together and telling these cuentos for as many of those out there who are willing to listen and who are looking to learn about this city we make up and that our people make up and have made up. And the last time that we actually got to speak, we spoke for probably 3 hours at Echo Park Lake. And it's because there's so much to get through. There's so much to say. We don't have 3 hours this evening, but it's just a little note for listeners in terms of how much we get into these cuentos, because we're just getting started out here. The work continues, as you said.
Definitely, 100%.
So let's start by introducing you to the listenership, to the viewership. You have an interesting banner or background behind you. It's reminiscent of the Dodgers, but it's not for the Dodgers or about the Dodgers. Tell us a little bit about this work that you're involved in and how this has become, how this has gone from a story to an organization and now a real call for accountability on the part of the city especially.
So, my history goes back, when I was like 15, 16, when I first started learning about the story from my grandparents and learning about the trauma and hearing these stories that sounded like fantasies, which led me into researching more throughout the years up until like 2015, when me and Melissa Rechiga, another former resident, and her family descendants of the three communities of Palo Verde, La Loma, and Bishop, we got together and talked about a lot of the trauma that still was hanging around the families and why we haven't really engaged in looking at what reparations would look like to fix it, to try to bring some peace. So from those conversations in 2016, we decided to form Buried Under the Blue in a nonprofit 501c3 to start the road to justice, right? And reparations, to see what that would look like, but also too, to make sure that we had a sense of what would happen if we even hit reparations. And we were already thinking into the future, like when we had them here already, because it's really about preserving los cuentos of our three communities, right? And how we integrated into places like Echo Park when we left those three, when we were displaced from those three communities. So the organization itself has centered itself really in the value of community, because in the three communities, we only valued community. There wasn't home ownership and there wasn't a renter. It was just one giant familia and one giant rancho. And so we think that's so important, what's missing from our communities today. So really, we wanted to preserve the history, but also start that journey to justice and reparations. And that was the main focus of Buried Under the Blue now. And now that we're here, we've done a lot of work, a lot of engagement, and we're happy with the results. And we've gotten a lot of the descendants and family members to become members of the organization.
Right. And so to be sure, for someone who's entering this conversation just now, maybe they're in LA, maybe they're in the Inland Empire or just California in general, to be certain about this cuento, to be certain about these historias, what we're talking about here is the forced removal of your family as well as a number of other families from These three communities, known as La Loma, Bishop, and Palo Verde, commonly referred to today as the Chavez Ravine. And so this is the land upon which the Dodgers organization now conducts their business. The Dodgers organization being a billion-dollar empire and the envy of organizations all around the world for the weight and muscle they command. And so it's actually you and your family who were on that land first, just to be certain we're on clear terms here.
Yeah, well, prior to us, and that's another thing that we're working on with the organization is what does reparations look like? We also have a national campaign, which is changing reparations. So we weren't the first people on the land. The first people were the Kizh Nation, the first lineal descendants of the LA Basin. So one of our claims to that, right, is that we cannot claim land back. Land back really goes back to them, but that our families, because our grandparents and great-grandparents invested there, we ask for that investment to be in our honor and their honor, because that investment was based upon the American dream. That when they came here, they could build it, right? And that at one point they would be able to pass it on through inheritance. So we were the third people to ever be on this land, but the original people were the Kizh Nation here.
Oh, absolutely. I appreciate you calling attention to the Aboriginal people and those people who have a historic claim to land back. And what you're describing actually is your family having arrived to the United States around when precisely? What is it that you know, and why is it that they landed in Chavez Ravine, or what is referred to as Chavez Ravine, rather than West Hollywood or Beverly Hills or even the Slauson area at the time? Why is it that they landed in this more central portion of Los Angeles?
Well, just to give you a sense of what it was like back then, you had the racial covenants, right? And all the racism around, except in this little ravine. And this ravine was not sought after by anybody because it was just a piece of trash land to a lot of people, but not to our people. They saw the ability to adapt to an environment where they created houses on stilts, right? And they came around 1920, most of the family. And once they arrived, they basically started utilizing everything in the neighborhood. At that time, the old Victorian homes were being torn down. Mm-hmm. We were in the rise of the craftsman home. So a lot of these places were just built with just places that were being demolished, toilets they took from other places, and they built the three communities. And, a lot of people used to say that they were the Shangri-La, the poor people's house, but these were very well-built houses that, as we found out throughout the history, there was just so much that was not told about these three communities. It was the polar opposite of what you're learning in Chicano studies or any book that's been written out there, because these are coming, the stories or the cuentos are coming straight from our family. Like I mentioned earlier, like my grandparents, we had 6 generations there. And then my great-grandparents were the third people there. My grandparents, who are still alive today, and my mom was the last one to be born there. So that history line was, I could just turn to my grandparents and say, what was it like? Most of the time we can't do that because we read everything out of books. So it was a very, very important time for LA. And one key reminder about it too, remember, these fights predate the civil rights movement and the Chicano movement. This is all pre anything that we've ever read. And it was very important that we understood these 3 stories because these were the stories of early wealth and real estate portfolios.
Right. When you mentioned the 1920s, I think about the Civil War in Mexico in particular from 1910 until about 1920. And then a decade later, there was this repatriation, so-called repatriation, where due to the Great Depression across the United States, Mexican Americans, including Mexican Americans who were born in the United States, were forcibly sent out to Mexico. And so you're talking about this period, this very sort of delicate period in U.S. history, especially for Mexican American communities.
Oh, definitely, yeah. That was one of the reasons why they left Mexico, to find a new place in the United States, not understanding everything that was here, but they understood one thing when we got from my grandparents to the stories of the cuentos that came to us, were basically that they sent people out here prior, like a little search party. When they found this place, they sent word back that you were able to get a title. And those titles didn't come right away to the land. They actually waited about 5 to 6 years. So around 1925, 1930 were the first titles when they came out to the land. And once they grabbed those, they had a piece of the American dream. Nobody else had that in Los Angeles. And these covenants were everywhere. So you couldn't just go any one place. How they obtained them is still a mystery because of those racist covenants. But the more we dig in, the more we understand how smart they were to integrate into that political system too. And that at that time, you had Julian Chavez, who was the owner of that area prior to selling and piecing it out. And, we saw that he might have had some type of influence on how that land was transferred over. But there's not real clear history. And as we dig, a lot of the archives that the city has have been destroyed over the years. So it's still a mystery now, but we're still digging in the archives.
Do we have an estimation of how many families were there, at least as far back as 1950? Do we have an idea about how many families may have been in this ravine initially donated by Julian Chavez, as you had said?
Roughly you had about 1,200 to 1,400 people.
Wow.
So it was a pretty big community.
Especially at that time. I mean, LA was not the metropolis or the megalopolis that it would become post 1960s. It was still a pueblito coming up in so many different respects. So a community of 1,200 people, especially in a city with racial covenants and red-lined areas throughout, that was a huge deal. Actually, that was a true community for Mexican Americans, especially in LA.
Yeah, and it was a good example to see that, in some weird ways, the more we analyze this and the more we look at racism and hate, right? Racism and hate. Racism and hate saved these three communities, and they were able to adapt and grow because nobody cared about them. We didn't get city services. The city just wanted their taxes after they got the land and the deeds to the lands. And they were able to evolve into early communities that today we're trying to create, right? They were self-sustainable. They grew their own fruits and vegetables. They grew their own meats. They had their own businesses. They had their micro businesses in homes. And we also had street vendors. And so this whole little town had its dollars circulate all the time. So it never left. And this is one of the reasons why they were able to build generational wealth and not own just one home, but multiple homes. And these homes then, were some of the earliest portfolios that if today they still had. Dodger Stadium land is worth a lot today, but we know they would have never sold their lands because historically our brown communities, they rarely move around, unless they're forced through gentrification, policy changes, do they ever decide? But most of them will stay for generations in the same area. So this is why we look at it and we're just like, why wasn't it told in the fashion that we believed in, the way our grandparents had pride in it, because it was so dangerous, we feel, to that society at that time. And even today, like to think that we could do it on our own and we could build a community to the point where, like in the Korean War, the families had gotten together and finally said, look, because we have deeds and we're part of the American dream now, our kids need to be given to the war to fight for this country because we had something to fight for now. To come back in 1958, 1 year before the violent eviction. And so this is why a lot of the times we have these feelings and you get these cuentos that come out about we don't ever want to own a home anymore because they may take it, or we don't care about government, or we don't care about the war because look what they did to us. But these create generational trauma, ripple effects that continue to this day.
Wow. I certainly see where you're going with this analysis and what I want to be certain about, because there is so much to say, including about the history. To be clear, since Bishop La Loma and Palo Verde were razed to the ground and destroyed, and because the people there were forcibly evicted by 1959, you grew up hearing about this place, but you could only encounter it through the memories of your grandparents, through the memories maybe of your more direct parents, and obviously through what you would come to learn in conversations with your peers or contemporaries and collaborators. But tell me a little bit about where you grew up, actually, with respect to this forced displacement of your greater family.
So after Palo Verde, right, most of them moved into Echo Park. That's where I was born and raised. And one of the things that we got a taste of, just a slight bit of it in Echo Park, and everybody that's grown up in Echo Park knows this, regardless of what happened in the 80s and the 90s with all the news that came out on how bad we were still a knit-tight community. I grew up on the Morton Echo Park site across the street from the Del Mar apartments, and we actually lived in an old fire station across the street from it. What we had there was a community very, not 100%, but very similar to the way Palo Verde, La Loma, and Bishop worked, which we had a little store across the street called El Bate. And I remember it like it was yesterday. Avelia was the owner. And back in those days, we didn't have money. My mom was on food stamps, and food stamps only would go to like 3 weeks. And then the fourth week was that crazy week where you didn't know what was going to happen, how you were going to feed people. Well, Avelia was a very important part to our community there, because if it wasn't for her, I remember when my mom first went there and she says, hey, look, I don't got money. There was no credit check, which is weird when you think about it now. She basically opened the black book and said, write your name here. And when you come in, you put the amount that you bought. And then when you get your food stamps next month, you pay me back. And this was in our community. We don't, I see it very rarely, like here in Lincoln Heights where I'm at now. There's a couple of stores that do that for seniors. But this was so important because this was a piece of what my grandfather was talking about. That it was a community. It wasn't about the money. It was about your survival. It was about, can you afford? And if you can, I can help you because I have to give you. And so this is something that was weird to me at the time, because I was just like, how do you buy something without money? But we did get to see that a little bit, because a lot of the members stood around the local areas, which formed communities of Echo Park. And so that was really important to us. And I learned a lot in Echo Park just growing up there, that we weren't all bad. We didn't have opportunities. And this is what led me down the road to really look to see how I can bring, with my talents, is to bring opportunities for the kids, to give them a way out. We didn't have that growing up. And I was very lucky in my early life because I met a lot of good people along the way that kind of kept me. I wasn't a trouble person or anything, but I used to hang out with a lot of the gang members in Echo Park. We used to go fishing, hiking. They were just regular kids, just not the opportunity that they needed to get them out of that environment.
Right. When you describe that, it's reminiscent of the way that the so-called Chavez Ravine community was described, in that, especially for those who did not frequent the area, who knew nothing of it, except for when they read a spectating news article about it, of course they would come away with ideas or notions about the place, especially on racial terms, because that is also a part of this American legacy, and that is something you all experienced firsthand on so many levels. And then to think that in Echo Park, there was this reputation of the area, once again, on racial terms, and once again, about the troublesome and violence-prone community, especially youth there. You had a situation in which actually, on the ground, knowing this place was entirely different. You're still here as just one descendant of that time, and so firsthand, through lived experience, what these community members actually were in their whole being, especially as young people coming up in this city, this city that now basically treats Echo Park as a whole new investment for the 21st century. So one that has finally been cleared of its slum status, but once again on racial terms, because of the increasing gentrification of Echo Park.
Definitely. No, I agree 100% with that. And it's so tragic that those policies, they evolve with time, but the outcome is the same for brown folks. Your displacement, whenever you hear a beautification, like Echo Park, when revitalization came, those terms trigger people now. Revitalization means the erasure of your community and the uprooting of the people. There's so much that I learned throughout the time, like when we titled Green Gentrification itself through policy, right? And far too often we see that, and as people, because we've never engaged because of the traumatic experience we have with LAPD and government, how do we get to those points, right? They've been very successful to intimidate us. In my life, I was shown that you had to step up to those things to understand everything. Because when I looked at it from that perspective and I went in, I said, hey, we're not so stupid. We're in here, and I felt this same way when I was just a young kid in there. So we weren't wrong, but because we're told we're wrong and we read the narrative that we were poison, gang infested, we weren't going to go anywhere, we were the lowlifes of the world, that was one of the things that they did to the 3 communities prior to going in and looking for housing, because LA has a huge problem with never building enough housing. So this is nothing new what we're seeing today. And the outcome is what we see happening when they don't build it. And now the needs here and inflation goes up and people hit the streets. So this all could have been prevented decades ago, because gentrification didn't just happen in the last decade or two. This has been planned throughout history. And so even today, when we look at policy, I often, being elected now and being on land use, I often tell them, how can I apply these racist policies that are continuing to have the same outcomes that almost 4 or 5 generations of my family have felt? And I've seen the evolution of it, that it doesn't stop. The racism doesn't stop, the land use, and in modern days today, they're like reservation. Today we have economic racism because you can't buy in Echo Park anymore, where once your reservation was beautiful. Now you're in Texas. That's your new reservation. And so a lot of these things we can see happening through time, and it's, it gets sometimes tired to see it because we are a majority in the city. We can't stop it, but we're also the most traumatized people of government and police. And how do we get over that hump? I'm here, I've gotten over it, right? But I still remember Rampart scandal. I can tell you everything because I was there at the time we were working on some of those cases. So I understand what people feel, and it led me to have a lot of patience with people while organizing.
So, Vincent, just to be sure, with respect to Echo Park, having grown up there, I take it that you went to Belmont High School?
Yes. I went to Logan, King, and then Belmont.
Wow.
Born and raised, I said, from all the way down. But that's just what you did when you were in Echo Park. If you didn't go to Logan, you went to Elysian Heights. And if you didn't go to Elysian Heights, you went to Mayberry.
Yeah, I mean, and Belmont High School is also a historic high school in LA, and it continues being an important site for especially this Latin or Latinx or brown or Mexican American community and so much more. So it's an historic place to be a part of, actually, and to call your high school, I would say.
Yeah, big time. I mean, it's one of the nicest schools, oldest schools that was there, but
yeah.
And it has the history with the walkouts with Sal Castro and like Lincoln High and all the other ones. But yeah, Belmont was just, Echo Park was just a special place. For me, I tell a lot of people sometimes, when you look back at your community, I have a real big respect for Echo Park. The people that were there, just the history, it's so rich and people just never talked about it. And just even growing up around Echo Park Lake is another story in itself. I mean, I could stay hours on here just reminiscing all those, the places we used to hang out, or just people, so many different characters in the neighborhood too.
Oh yeah, especially because of that lake, especially because of the way that it centers so much and the way that so many different people from all across the city can get together there. But if you've grown up in Echo Park, there are a few small places, we might say, that only having grown up in Echo Park you'll be exposed to. So one of those special places that I really want to ask you about is this place once known as Pioneer Market. I want to ask you about what you remember about Pioneer Market, how this was a place-making space for you and maybe some of your friends, probably your familia. Tell us a little bit about Pioneer Market, where today Lassen's Market now stands, actually.
God, where do I start with Pioneer? That was the center of Echo Park. The owner, Michael Lum, was very, when you hear these racial things of brown folks and white folks, that didn't exist with him. He was very white, Mike. But I'll say one thing. When I started the Becky Thatcher Tom Sawyer Fishing Derby in Echo Park, this was when I was in my late teens, early 20s. There was never a time when we didn't go to him, and we didn't have a 501c3 at the time, so he wasn't getting no tax write-off. Again, this was one of those things that you can go up to an owner and say, hey, look, the kids need this for the lake event. And he never once ever said no to us. He just said, get what you need. And of course, at that time, when you say that to someone like myself, I'm thinking, oh my God, the whole market's for me, right? But you even got that sense of just to take what you needed. that simple term, take what you need. And it really made those events with those kids, grow, that they loved it. It changed a lot of life. And Pioneer provided job training. So the kids would go there when back in those days, you needed to have at least some type of history of job work. Michael Lum was there to give you bagging, groceries, whatever he could put you in, he paid you and put you in there. So he was a real big, important part of Echo Park. And a lot of the old veterans there will know who he is. And he still resides there with his wife today.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, still there. I see his wife every once in a while on Sunset.
Wow. Now, you probably remember this system better than I do, but my family and I used to go to Pioneer Market just as well. And I remember it being a very distinct market and the experience there being very distinct from, say, going to Vaughn's or Ralph's or Food for Less. And that's because I believe there was a system at Pioneer Market where, like, after a handful of purchases, you'd get points or something. And then there was like a toy racket. And so if you had enough points, you could go and grab a toy for yourself. I mean, it was like magical. We wanted to go to Pioneer every time just for that, just to see what else we could get. But because Pioneer Market is no longer here, because it's been gone for so long, I struggled to find other people who might be familiar with that system. So do you remember anything like that or something of that sort when you were growing up and going to Pioneer Market?
Oh, definitely. Michael Lum had so much stuff there to do with points, and he was very well aware too of people's needs and how they accumulated, how much they shopped there. And he did have those type of customer appreciation types of things. Another one that was there, and people will know, but it wasn't through Pioneer. It was more of a kind of like a commercial version of it. Was everywhere you would go, you'd get a booklet, and it used to have a little squirrel and a stamp on it. And you would collect these stamps at different places, anybody that participated with them, and you could get that little booklet and go downtown, and you can go and shop in their little store down there too. Michael Lum had a different one of it, but I even have some of the original stamps that my grandparents sent me because I couldn't believe that I could remember that stuff. I must have only been about 11, 10 years old at the time. But it's amazing how these memories stick with you. And as you get older, they become more powerful in remembering them and understanding them.
Wow. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, and that's so important for us to hear for those of us who might frequent Echo Park nowadays, to know that, one, there was a Pioneer Market to begin with, and then that Michael Lum was pivotal to the community through Pioneer Market, and that actually he and his wife continue in the community today. That's all just, again, the Los Cuentos de Los Ángeles in the most intimate ways, in the smallest of ways, that nonetheless have such a major connection to the history of this city. So I really do appreciate your notes on Pioneer Market.
Thank you. No, and they're important. I think everybody, I put a couple of posts up recently of some old pictures, and it's just amazing how it triggers people. Studio One, the shack where we used to get our teriyaki chicken and beef with Mary. I mean, we knew these people by name. And that's what made it so knit tight when my grandfather used to talk about it. Not that I picked it up when I was younger. Now, being older, I said, you know what? We did have a piece of our own Palo Verde there. We just didn't recognize it, because it was so painful for our grandparents to even talk about that time. Even my mother, she was only 8 years old when it happened. But it shows, and I started learning that trauma carried on, that it ruined sometimes even having a simple cuento to talk about. And you get deeper when you even talk about Mexico, and they had to leave Mexico. They didn't want to leave Mexico. But during the revolution, they came here, and then they had another revolution here and another one, and we still continue on with this trauma.
Right. Now, to be sure, because you mentioned Palo Verde, I recall that I was looking at some archival images, and this is from some time ago. I really couldn't count the number of days. How many days have passed since I saw these images, but I think I remember seeing something about Palo Verde and Bishop and La Loma having maybe a small little league in between them, where the youth would compete, where the youth would play and compete with each other. That I thought was tremendous, because I mean, when you describe this neighborhood, when you describe these neighborhoods and the people there and how they were self-sustaining, actually how the economy there was circular. Now that you mention all these things, I realize, oh, right, like, so why wouldn't they have their own little league at that, where the kids could play and hang out and actually excel in their own particular ways? And so that, I think, is something that's also really important to uplift, is that, like, there were also programs in between these communities, and of course you and your family were repping for Palo Verde. I assume this was kind of like your side and who you competed for when you lined up against your neighbors here.
Yeah, they were competitive, but they weren't, how can I put it? Like, the kids didn't fight at that point. It was just one giant family. And that was the rarity when you hear the discussion on how even policing, right? Like, we talk about it today and we're like trying to think, how do we police ourselves? And well, these people didn't have police. The service never served them. So a lot of these kids, like, when they were growing up, they got real values. I heard one story from my grandfather when he told me about a kid trampling on this old lady's garden. So there was, they said, yeah, we beat him in the butt, to get him to understand. But his punishment really was, for 2 seasons, he had to replant her whole garden. And so with that, he got a skill out of it, right? Because one day he would own a piece of land that he would have to farm and hopefully not have someone come and destroy his food, right? Because they relied on that. And I think those things were very, important for us to learn community policing. These communities were ahead of their time. And even in the recreation department of it, yeah, they had swimming in the river. They had their own baseball field there. It wasn't, how can I put it? Like, it wasn't shaped like the diamond. It was just an empty field that they all played in. But they also were excellent in their high schools when they played basketball and football, because they excel. So these people had that opportunity. And like I always tell people, when you look at that, it gives you hope to the future, because if we're given the opportunities or we provide them ourselves, our kids are just as good as anybody else's kids given that chance. And so I think that's important for all of us to take from these cuentos, right? Is that the opportunities can be created and it can also be given. But at some point, the creation is the best thing you can do to create your own opportunity. That's what the United States was built on, and that's what our stories are built on, because they were given the opportunity to own land, and our people proved that they could build an empire with it. Only to have the very dream become a nightmare with local government and policy and a threat to their establishment. And so that's how we've always looked at it in our family, but we've never given up on it.
Now, to be certain, in our show notes or in the brief list of questions that I proposed for us, I noted to you that it was on May 8th, 1959, a date that you know very well, that the last familias were forcibly removed from Bishop La Loma and Palo Verde, or what is referred to as the Chavez Ravine, to make way for Dodger Stadium. And so we've kind of touched on it briefly in our conversation so far, but I want to ask you a little bit about how this severely traumatized families, for one, to be so violently removed by the LA Police Department out of their homes, these homes that they and their families had known for generations, and how this actually led directly to homelessness for some of the families who were evicted. And I think in telling that, we will come to understand a little more about the current crisis that we're looking at throughout the city of Los Angeles, throughout LA County, throughout the state of California, and really across this country.
Yeah, I mean, it dates back to, again, LA never having enough housing. So at this time, the city proposed to take away our homes for housing, which is similar, because anytime there's a housing crisis, they enter into the poorer neighborhoods and they build the homes off our backs, right? So we saw that then, like we see it today. And I think one of the most important things to note on that was, in the taking, this was the first time they took away private property. So this is another important part of history, because just a year before the eminent domain was actually put out, you could not take a private home the way they did and give it to a corporation, right? There was an amendment, a constitutional amendment to it, which allowed them to do what they did now. So in some ways, we were the first case precedent ever set. All this stuff is new to a lot of people because they've never heard the story, right? But in the taking, the violence was just being able to come in after, and remember, this is after 1958. The Arechiga family had lost many members of its family to the war after believing they had a piece of the American dream, only to have come back. And there's some archival footage of it, of where she's standing, Miss Arechiga, Abrana, is standing near a sign that says, "This is what we fought for." So you could just imagine, after losing a son, losing a husband, and then coming and they're rolling down the road and they fought for this home. They went and died for their properties, only to have it ripped from them. And it wasn't something that we see like today, where today they're violent too. Don't underestimate that. But back then, there was nothing to regulate them. And this was on national TV. Nobody hid from it. And so bringing like the Arechiga family, just seeing those images and that 8mm film of them being drugged out, thrown down into the street. As soon as they removed them out of the house, the bulldozers were waiting there to just demolish the homes, right? So there was probably about a good 20 families that stood, but the most photographed family was the Arechigas. But a lot of the families went through that trauma. Once the city demolished everything, its only solution was to criminalize you again. After they threw you out as a homeowner onto the street, they basically came back with notices literally 2 days later and asked them to vacate the property. And this is something that we see today in the policies of the city. We don't make enough housing, we waste the money, and then we come back and we're going to blame you for that, because for some reason, somehow, these new people that are not homeless in the sense of homeless, but will be facing the streets, they're working 3 jobs. They just cannot afford the rents now. So the homeless now is very different to what it was before. But you too will also be criminalized at the end of the day. So this is why, as people, we really need to see these patterns, because when a pattern forms, it means that it's already structurally corrupt, that the outcome will be the same. And if we see this after generation, it's going to happen again. And so these policies must be changed. Anybody, like I tell politicians, if you're going to tell me that you're going to make a difference through using the same policies, it's a lie. You can't. All of us are inherently racist. The outcomes have been the same for generations. I'm here and I can testify to that through Echo Park and even today what we're seeing in Lincoln Heights.
Right. And to be sure, you mentioned an amendment to the Constitution. I assume that that's the state constitution, the Constitution in the state of California. And I have at least one more clarifying question. You said that first they were forcibly removed from their homes and that then they would be criminalized. To be clear on this, I believe what you mean is that first the homes were bulldozed, and the only resort that some of these families had at that moment was setting up camp or something of this sort, not far from their homes, within the ravine, within the immediate vicinity. But that not long after this, the city decided that they were criminals for this, essentially in the view of the city, squatting on land that they had just been violently evicted from.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like I said, there's even the original document for the Department of Health that they sent out, and they even mentioned the kids in it. It's like the Arechigas and the kids, you guys got to get out. And it's like I say, it's the cold and heartless rules of law that we have today that continue to happen in our housing situations, on our unhoused people.
Now, let's fast forward to 2024 for a moment, and let's talk a little bit about Assembly Bill 1950, actually, because it was just this past March that, to someone out there, maybe browsing online, reading a little bit about LA, maybe they see something like AB 1950 and think, hold on, there's this violent history within the Elysian Valley, within Chavez Ravine, but now, especially that the term reparations has become a little more frequent in political speak. Now, there are potential reparations on the way for the descendants of these families who were violently removed for Dodger Stadium. Let's talk a little bit about what AB 1950 actually is, so as to clarify for those types of readers, those types of residents here who may not fully understand the big picture here. And to do that, I want to just get into the text of AB 1950 for a moment. So I'll just read a little bit of the text just to be sure for us. If passed, Assembly Bill 1950, which was introduced just earlier this March by Assemblywoman Wendy Carrillo, if passed, AB 950 would create historical accountability, quote, mandating a comprehensive report detailing events surrounding the land acquisition and displacement and making it publicly available to foster transparency and education about this moment in LA history. 2, it would also create reparative measures, proposing various forms of compensation, including offering city-owned real estate comparable to the original Chavez Ravine landowners or providing fair market value compensation adjusted for inflation. The bill would also create pathways for displaced, non-land-owning residents to receive relocation assistance, healthcare access, employment support, educational opportunities, and other forms of compensation. And 3, finally, it would create a permanent memorial requiring the construction of a memorial on Chavez Ravine or adjoining property to honor the displaced residents and their legacy, unquote. So this all sounds good, but there's more to the cuento, actually. Can you shed some light on this for us?
No, there is. The one thing in there is accountability, the key term, right? When we look at reparations, reparations is very political. It's never been centered on the healing of the communities or even the healing of the taking of land. Buried Under the Blue is one of the first organizations, like I said earlier, when we talk about land back, we had to really take a step back and say, how could we grab land that was never ours? We came here. This is not our territory. If this was Mexico and the Purechepe territory where our families are from, this would be a whole different asking. But out of respect, so that it doesn't become a political land back, that it actually becomes what it's supposed to do, the healing practice, was to engage with the First Nations, the Kizh Nation. When I spoke to Chief Ali Salas on it, I told him, what do you think about that? Do we need government to step in to tell us what's right so that we can actually make reparations? That reparations doesn't only include our people, it includes the First Nations people, which are always left out. I made a point one time to look at Bruce's Beach and ask them, why wasn't the First Nation included? Because how can I accept any type of land back when the whole continent that we're on is stolen land? And if the government is going to say, well, we're going to give this land back, that's one thing that we need to talk about, because that's not real land back. That's political. And that's what makes it different than ours, that we can step back without government and literally say, give it back to the Kizh Nation. The land beneath Dodger Stadium today was once our home. Our grandparents invested their money into it. The only thing that we're entitled to under reparations is the financial restitution of what was taken from them, their investment. The land must go back to the Kizh Nation. That's number one on that. Another important part, where we were the first ever in reparations to include renters. Because in our community, it's about our values that we had there when we survived. Everybody was a community member and a family member, whether you owned a house or not. And this is why we're happy that some of them were put in, but that the reparations isn't complete, because when we talk about accountability, which will create credibility, right? This bill does not talk about people like the Dodgers. In it, they're named as private entity. The stadium is referred to as sports stadium. They're already mentioned in there. They're just not mentioned by name. And this is part of what reparations is that we got to understand everybody that was involved. It wasn't just the structure of government. There were people and elected officials that were in positions that made those decisions. There was a corporation who grabbed the land. There was an opportunity to give the land back. Okay, and then there's a lot of other stuff in the middle of it that we've put on social media of recordings. So there's evidence of people having what today would be extremely illegal, but they were having these conversations back then about the Dodgers behind the door. We hear this behind the door deal type of stuff. We got people admitting to it. And so this is why we took this stance, because reparations to us means that everybody must be held accountable. Not just the taxpayers of Los Angeles that benefited through taxes, right? Even though the Dodgers didn't pay all the taxes they were supposed to. And this is where a lot of people say it will get complicated. You got the big elephant in the room, which is the Dodgers. But this is not reparations. What this is a get out of free jail card for the elected officials and the Dodgers that did the damage. Because to punish the structure itself is to punish the taxpayer. And this is why this conversation about reparations and why we're holding it this way is so important. And this is why we took it national, because it must change. And this thing must be said in every reparation demand that's out there. It's always the First Nations first. They have been the longest without their motherland. They have a different approach on ownership and what they do with their land. No matter what it is and what they believe in, they need to be part of that discussion. The first lineal, and it's crucial that we add in lineal descendants. They must be documented descendants of the First Nations of that land. And that's where we stand on that. That's why it's so important to understand AB 50, because right now it's written as a get out of free jail card. What we're trying to do with Wendy, and the one thing that we told her, and we've been in conversation with her, is that we thank her for doing what she did, because for the first time ever in history, which is already done, is that there's an acknowledgement of an injustice that has not ever been acknowledged in decades, that the three communities were wrongfully taken from the people. And that's something that really affected my grandparents, because when I told them what had happened, they're just like, so now it's not in our head, it's in public. It's been spoken. That's what's important. But the reparation component of it needs to be fixed. And as of now, Buried Under the Blue does not support AB 50 in its current form. But we are still working with Wendy Carrillo, Ricardo Lara, and some of the other groups that are there to figure out how can we meet that. Because AB 50 is a mandate. It forces the city of Los Angeles to create the 9-person task force. So there's a couple of other things in the task force that we want to fix too. So we will be getting that document out to Wendy and Ricardo Lara and all parties to really sit down and have another discussion. And, Buried Under the Blue is very stern on its stance. And we don't want to give up those things because they're so important, not only to the national movement, they're just so important to brown folks on how we can heal planet. And we must start on square one and work our way up. And that it's not about the money necessarily. It's about the process of reparations, that we can now move from that the indigenous First Nations can move with us, and that we can work together to figure out, now that we're healing, you guys got the land back, you got your Mother Earth back, right? And we got our financial ability that we can, provide family members that don't have a home to get a home. How do we move forward from that? Because we do need to heal. We talk about this all the time about the healing process, but we far often allow the political narrative to get out. And that's the crucial point here, that narrative. The narrative that destroyed our three communities and the narrative that talks negative about our communities today, that must be captured by the people. And that's what some of these cuentos and what your work that you're doing is capturing a lot of these cuentos that are coming out that are told by the people for the people, so that we can move forward, because these are healing practices. They just don't read them at that.
Right. And as you said, this is the first time that a bill of this sort identifying your communities has made it to the official Congress of the state of California. And so that is a beginning that was not there before. But your main issue, at least one of your two main issues, is that the Dodgers are not officially named as being culpable for this forced displacement, this violent eviction of Mexican-American families from these three communities that we've talked about. And you have also pointed out that reparations must be inclusive of the Aboriginal people. And so what you're really talking about is a holistic process that is also a healing process. And obviously there are going to be great challenges in that, given the history of the state of California and the city of Los Angeles, including the ongoing history of these institutions or entities as tools for private entities and billion-dollar industries out there, such as the Dodgers, because that is, going back to 1959, but also prior to 1959, that for many of us, many students of history, has been the prime modus operandi, or the prime function of these partnerships between government and, say, the private sector. It's been making money and huge profits at every expense. And so what you're talking about is a different understanding of the land and what reclaiming this land may actually look like, including by holding accountable those actors who remain responsible for this history playing out as it has.
Definitely. And when you look at our story, there's an important part to understand that I share with a lot of people. I always tell people because they love their Dodgers, they don't want to give them up, right? And there's some, what's weird about it is that recently we've had a lot of Dodger fans reach out to us secretly. I won't mention them by name on here, but secretly to Instagram. And they can relate because of the issues of today, right?
Mm-hmm.
The thing that we share with all of them is this. Let's say let's blame the city of Los Angeles 100% for the theft of our land, the destruction of the three communities, right? In the laws of then and the laws of today, the Dodgers are in possession of stolen property, and that land must be returned back. No matter who you blame it here, the law itself and the way it's written gives us the right as U.S. citizens to fight for that land back. It should be given back. You cannot blame one without the other. And this is what happens when we learn about history and why this story is so important. It's one of those unique times that talks about housing, that talks about land back, and that now talks about justice and injustice and making justice out of it, right? And in that special moment, when they were writing these policies, you could understand that we were left out of it, because now we're in a situation when I bring that point up, when you can blame the city for being the thieves, right? And they're saying, we'll give you whatever you need. But what happens when the law is really applied? Are they above the law? Are the Dodgers above the law? We're asking this question right now in media with Trump. And this is a huge issue because this is exactly what corporations get. They become above the law because people are scared of their money in politics or what they can do. We need elected officials that are going to challenge that. We need elected officials that will sit with us and listen to this very simple rule. If you blame the city 100%, that means the Dodgers are in possession of stolen property and it should be returned. If you take something from me and they find it and you sell it, it gets returned back to me. It doesn't matter how much you paid for it or where you found it, because I'm the owner of the property. But not in our case, or at least it hasn't been tried yet in our case. And this is one of the things we tell people. Think about those things, because this is about your children's future. This is about your future. If we do not fight for these things today or bring them up to light, whether we think it affects us or not, it has been affecting us. And the reasons why people have hard lives today is because we don't engage. And we have to be in the majority of the nation now. We're not just the majority of California. You're the majority of the nation if you're brown. The question is, what do you utilize that power, that economic power, that political power to make change? Because it's not about a maybe. It's about get out from your house, engage. Listen to this podcast. What could you do? How could you network with us? How can you network with your networks? And what can we make an outcome to make it happen? Because it is very possible.
Now, especially on the point of possibilities, to be certain, since this was introduced by the Assemblywoman, by Wendy Carrillo, that is, you have mentioned that it would create a mandate for the city of LA. In your view, though, would it be more appropriate for the city of Los Angeles, for the LA City Council, maybe even the LA County Board of Supervisors, to be drafting this type of ordinance somewhere? Or do you think that something coming from the California legislature would be sufficient? Or do you see a process where maybe LA City and LA County, as well as the state legislature, maybe they pool resources, develop an ad hoc committee or something of that sort with your organization and your collaborators and come to an agreement from there? What do you think is appropriate here, given that it was the city of LA in particular, as well as the Dodgers organization, behind the violent removal of these communities from the ravine?
Well, in reality, it's just the approach, because remember, look, it's all agencies from the federal housing to the state to the county. I mean, when you look at this story, everybody had their hand in it. And so for me, it doesn't matter where it comes from, as long as it's written in the words and the ways that the community, the people that actually lived the trauma, that are still living the trauma today. Because when it's written, for example, from the perspective of Wendy, and I had this conversation with her because she called me, we were on a meeting, and she's like, who do you blame? I mean, that was like the first question out of her, like, who do you blame? I said, of course, the Dodgers, the campaign, everything that we've done. And we also blame the elected officials. And she's like, but I don't. And I go, then you don't need to be part of the bill, you're biased. And how do I come to that? Well, thank God for the training of the neighborhood council and our bias training, because, I mean, if you purchase a Dodger ticket, how can I trust that you're looking out for us, the people that were the victims of the Dodgers, the victims of the county supervisors, the city council, right? You keep saying that they're not, but for some reason you won't even mention them in the bill, and you guys are the authors. How can I trust you as an elected official when I know very well what the situation is? Because this is not my first rodeo with politicians and corporations. I'm pretty sure even in the basic knowledge, we know that they go hand in hand. And to make a mockery of law, I just told her, if I took this to court and I presented it to a judge as a case, the first thing out of that judge's mouth is going to ask me, who is the private entity? Why aren't they named? And who is the sports stadium and which one is it? And so we're already making points in there that already kind of paint them in the negative, because there was also an assessment of land. And they mentioned in there the sports stadium or the entity basically got the land for nothing. And this is like, I'm telling them, I go, do you understand as a person that is a descendant, that I have my grandparents, my mom that was physically there, my grandparents that suffered that, how it makes a mockery of who we are as people because you think we're that dumb, that we cannot read past the political rhetoric, and that we demand, not ask, we demand that you change that. We demand that you add them. We demand that you hold the people accountable, because we will not be a Bruce's Beach. You will not take advantage and take us to that point where you won't acknowledge the First Nations and you won't acknowledge the atrocities, because these are the real atrocities that happen. Some of these families that were there, like the Han family, they have generations of wealth that they've collected on these decisions they made. To this day, they still make those monies and they still hold those lands. Their inheritance didn't go nowhere, but their decisions and what destroyed those three communities, that's where it went wrong. That's what accountability is. Without the accountability, there is no credibility in this bill. And I made sure she understood that, because the families will back away. There may be a division even within the family because it's about money at the end. But for our families, the ones that were there and the ones that have always resisted, we will continue to resist, because that money means nothing to us. What matters is that we can make a healing process, because money's going to come and go and you can't take it with you. We believe very, very much of how the indigenous people believe in land, that it is not given to you. You're never going to own it. It's something that you leave for the next generation. And that's how we believe. In a modern day time, it's very difficult to apply ownership and not, right? Because you have to have it for the law. But in reality, our goal is always to leave it to the next generation of people, because the way we leave that land is the way we were in life. And that's how they get to know us too, through that process. So that is very understandable versus the way they deal with their stuff, right? You can't take it with you. And so you must respect it, and it must be given, and it must be inherited so that we have something for the future. Or else what are we going to have? Like what we have today, nothing but problems and ailments and young people really not living life, not even understanding the basics of it. We want to prevent that because we've all had that when we were younger.
Right. What you've talked about, what we've discussed is breaking a cycle in so many different respects and setting a new path forward for those still to come, for that next generation, for climate change and the fact that people need to be housed under the conditions that we will continue to face in more and more extremities because of the way that we have polluted the environment for so long. To be sure, say that someone has touched into our conversation today, they are passionate about what you're saying, they want to support your organization and volunteer or help out in any other way they can. Tell us, where do we begin that path? How do we get connected with you? How do we support what you're doing with Buried Under the Blue?
So first, visit us at www.buriedundertheblue.com and subscribe to our email list. We do send out a bunch of emails and opportunities, and when we're working on projects that we do like to engage, even if you're not from the three communities, it's just about community itself and education. And we have our petition on change.org, which you could also find. There's a section on our website that says how to support. They'll give you a list of all our social medias. We're on Instagram and TikTok at buriedundertheblue.com. So any like, share, follow, reach out, DM us. You have ideas on memes, posts, we're going to need all that stuff. And so we definitely like working with a lot of people to get their perspective on the issue, because like we always tell ourselves, we're not 100%. This is uncharted territory. And there are people that are just free thinkers that come up with I met some great people and some great ideas with them. And I think really it's about us coming together like we had that community and really trying to figure out how we can create that and it get bigger with the movement. Because like I said, this story is the center of what we're going through today. Displacement is in everybody's mind. Can we pay the rent? And if not, where will we go? That is exactly how the people of Palo Verde felt. And today that continues to happen to their same family, different generation, right? And those are some of the heavy discussions that we have with people. So definitely that way, social media, visit our website, and just support anything that we're doing, any of our outreach items or actions. And we welcome anybody to give us any input or their part on it.
Absolutely. And Vincent, before the session ends, I'm going to bug you for a screenshot just because our mamas and our abuelitas deserve that. So let's make it happen. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Uno, dos, y tres. Thank you so very much for joining me on this installment of JT the LA Storyteller podcast. I'm going to reach out to you in our DMs in just a sec, but as usual, the time flows in talking with you, V.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you once again.